You're watching Face to Face. I'm your host, Tim Vince. I'm delighted to be joined by David Hoffbrand. He's a well-known Christian author and speaker. Great to see you, David.
Thanks for having me.
And you're well known for your devotionals on the Sabbath, the 52 Sabbaths, and the Jewish Jesus. Before we get into that, I'm interested in your background. I had a little pre-chat with you, but just you were part of the Masorti Jewish organization. Just describe that, because not many people would have heard of that.
Yeah, I think most people are aware of the Hasidic, the very Orthodox Jews, and then probably people are aware there's a more liberal wing. And then the Masorti was founded, I think in the UK, by Rabbi Louis Jacobs, and it was a very it was a sort of less orthodox, but still sticking to a lot of the orthodox way of living and so on. So we were not orthodox in any way. I was raised by liberal, intellectual Jewish parents, very loving, very accepting, but we were culturally Jewish, and that meant we were going to synagogue. Services were in Hebrew, and the women did sit upstairs, the men sat downstairs. So it was that kind of experience, but not by any means a kind of very Orthodox Jewish community.
Yeah. And so looking now, I'll go straight into the thick of it, from your own Christian faith, or you would say Messianic Jewish faith.
I would.
How would the Masorti view you?
Oh, well, I don't... My experience of Jewish people is not the very Orthodox, where there would be definitely a lot of hostility. Understand it for lots of reasons. We can go into those. But in my experience, most Jewish people are quite accepting in many ways. They might not agree, but there wouldn't necessarily be hostility, simply disagreement and simply a sense of... I think for Jewish people, one of the key things is, due to the history of persecution and all the other things that Jewish people experienced, their understanding is, if you are following Jesus, you are Christian. You have stopped being Jewish in that sense. Whereas I would see myself as a Messianic Jew, and all of the early church were Messianic Jews. Yeah. So that would be how they would see it, probably. And
also, obviously, the church as it is today is largely Gentile. Yes. So they may feel threatened that there's an attempt to Gentilize. Christianize may, in their mind, think, no, this is just part of a whole line of trying to take out our Jewish culture.
Yeah, I think what Jewish people have experienced is a lot of evangelism done in a very, very bad way. Or forced conversions, or all sorts of stuff. And so Jewish people are wary of Christians trying to evangelize them. And to evangelize them in ways that are not like biblical. They're not the ways that Paul said. Paul said make them jealous.
Yeah, exactly.
But often Christians haven't made Jewish people very jealous. And so that leads to centuries and centuries and centuries of Jewish people feeling like Christians are the enemy.
That's it.
Rather than kind of this, I think a lot of Christians think of themselves as, well, we're kind of like brothers, aren't we? We're almost like, and that's not Jewish people's experience. The pogroms, the Inquisition, even the Holocaust was kind of based on a blueprint that Martin Luther wrote out, and so on. So
I'll just tell you something else, because I used to, I don't know how I got in, but I used to be part of a committee monitoring anti-Semitism. It was about 20 odd years ago. But they would always include in their summary evangelistic campaigns, because some of them were quite nasty. They would caricature the Jew as miserable. It was exactly as Goebbels would do it. And then you can be, very happy Christian, a Christian Jew, as it were, which is threatening.
And extreme. And these kind of caricatures, that's what characterizes anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the key reasons I wrote the book, even the first book, The Jewish Jesus, was because I felt like not only do Christians need to recover this sense of, hold on a second, Jesus is actually Jewish, but also Christians need to present Jewish people with an accurate picture. So they get to decide based on some accurate understanding of who Jesus or Yeshua is, rather than this caricatured kind of complete contrast with everything Jewish.
Okay, so I know you've been on the channel before, so people know quite a lot about you, David. But I want to sort of throw some googlies, difficult questions. And one is the verses like, famous verses like, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile." Is that just a chronological? Is Paul, when he's setting out, is very much, he's in Romans talking about Jews and Gentiles, and then has God finished with the Jews sort of thing, which is great. But what's the point he's making when he says first for the Jews?
So I don't think we can have a definitive answer.
Yeah.
I really don't. And I think there's a lot of things like that. However, I think if you understand the context of Romans, and I love what David Pawson explains about this, how Romans, and it's funny because we forget that the letters, people went to enormous trouble to write letters in those days. It wasn't like, oh, I'll just scribble this down. It took months and months. And they were written to deal with things. They were written into situations. And the situation in Rome that Paul's dealing with is the Jews and the Gentiles saying, we don't want the Jews back.
Yeah.
And so he's writing the whole of the letter of Romans effectively to counter replacement theology and this schism. So that Romans 9, 10, 11, which some people say is this kind of funny moment he has, and we'll just leave that and we'll carry on afterwards, is the pinnacle. It's like where his whole point, really. And so this idea of to the Jew first and then the Gentile is, I think, both chronological, but also there's an element where Paul's saying, remember, to the Gentiles who were saying, we don't need the Jews. He's saying, remember, you've been brought into their tree. And you know, the whole history of Christian anti-Semitism and the way that the church has seen the Jewish people is kind of stemmed a lot from this thing of Christians getting rid of this word also and replacing it with instead. You know, we're the church now instead. When throughout the Bible you see always the word also attached to the Gentiles. Yeah. You know, Jesus says, I have other sheep who are not of the sheepfold. They also need to come. Yeah. Salvation is being granted unto the Gentiles also. They're amazed by this. And so I think with this idea to the Jew first and then the Gentile, there's a sense of both chronology, but also a sense of, look, the new covenant even was made with the Jewish people and then extended to the Gentiles.
Shall I add another word, only? And I'll tell you why, because I know that you knew Lance Lambert many years ago, and I grew up with him.
Yeah.
And I memorized Romans. Yeah. And I only, two people I recited it to, 12 chapters, was my dad and Lance Lambert. And I never forget, he knew it himself. So whenever I made a mistake, he would get me. And it was in Romans 2, where I said, a man is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and circumcision not outward, but not merely outward. And Lance said, only. And what he was saying, because I should have said, a man is not a Jew who is only one outwardly. Yes. And he picked me up on it, and he was absolutely right, because so we divide. We say, look, you're not a Jew if you don't follow all the commandments. But actually, if it's only outward, then you're mistaken.
Yeah, and this is exactly the misunderstanding. It's because we have a framework that goes old, new, Jewish, Christian, you know, and so we slot things into that. And so, for instance, people would sometimes say to me, after I became a believer, so did you used to be Jewish?
Yeah, that's good.
But the only reason they could say that to me is because that's what they think about Jesus. Yeah. Some Christians think he used to be Jewish. So once you get back, in fact, I think the whole history of Christian anti-Semitism for me is only possible because of the Jesus that's stripped of his Jewishness. It's much harder to be anti-Semitic if your saviour is actually clearly Jewish and you know, presenting as Jewish. So
okay,
I think
next question.
Go on.
Which for me is a key one in terms of all of my friends among the Jewish community, and that is when Paul says that he might provoke his brothers to jealousy. How do you provoke, as a Gentile Christian, and we could talk about as a Jewish, you know, believer in Yeshua, how do you provoke them to jealousy? Certainly not by the pogroms and the Crusades, no. But how do you do it?
This is a great question and something I'm dealing with a lot. Another way you don't provoke jealousy is by blowing the shofar around every corner. Yeah. you know, becoming more Jewish than Jewish people.
Pretending. Fakery.
What would kind of almost be seen as cultural appropriation in any other situation, but somehow Christians think that that will, you know, endear them to Jewish people, and that's not true. I think one of the things I love, again, I'll go back to something David Pawson said, actually. Okay. He said, the church is supposed to make the Jewish people jealous, but instead it's tried to make them envious. Jealousy is, we have something that is yours. Envious is, we have something you should want. To make Jewish people jealous, we need to have, first of all, an understanding of who Jesus really is, that actually is biblical, and recognizes him as the King of the Jews, recognizes him not as the kind of a hater of the Torah, but somebody who says, I've come to bring the fullness. If we have that understanding, that will help. That'll be a start. When you have that understanding, then you also start to have to think, hold on, how does Yeshua, if he still identifies by his Jewish heritage, how does he feel about the Jewish people? Then you can start to carry God's heart in that way for the Jewish people. You allow God to show you actually, what does it mean that he's still got a plan? What does it mean that he still loves the Jewish people? As Paul says, they are still the people he loves. And then you can start to speak to Jewish people with some kind of heart and understanding that isn't about you wanting to be Jewish. It's simply about recognizing that you don't have to be Jewish to follow Jesus. That doesn't make him less Jewish. That you've been brought in. That's what Paul is saying in a way, is carry that attitude of humility and love. And I think one thing is to remember that everything we have has come through the Jewish people. And if you carry that in your heart, in a simple way, just like you would in another family situation, where you realize, you know, it's like, say, my wife. I have to honor her parents. I have to honor her family. Without them, it doesn't matter, you know, they're not perfect. I'm not perfect. But everything I have of my wife comes through them.
Yeah, very good.
And I think it's the same for Christians. If we carry that heart that isn't like trying to do the Jewish festivals or trying to kind of, but is nonetheless recognizing and understanding more than our roots, because our roots, sometimes people go, you know, it's in the past. Yeah. But no, the New Testament remains a very Jewish book. And recognizing, going back to that word also, I'm not a Christian instead, I'm a Messianic Jew. I'm a follower of Yeshua also. I'm Jewish and a follower of Yeshua.
So that's great, a great answer. I mean, there's two sides, isn't it? It's how we provoke the Jewish people in the right way. And in the right way, how do we provoke fellow Christians, let's say, dare I say, evangelical Christians, who theologically don't see the point. They think, well, there's only one way through repentance, and there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female. So they say, well, why should we be singling out a special approach to the Jewish people?
There's so many answers to different aspects of that, isn't there? First of all, even when we talk about no male or female, I mean, by the same token, there's no male or female. So if we're not going to make a distinction between Jew and Gentile, well, then we can't make a distinction between male and female either. And actually, we do.
There is a distinction.
We do. We very much do. So I think if we want to, well, here's what I think. It says in Romans 11:25, it says, brethren, and this is written, it's funny, isn't it? It's not written to the Israel prayer group in Rome. No. It's written to all of them. Brethren, I do not desire that you would be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own opinion, that a blindness in part has come to the Jewish people until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. So Paul says there's an ignorance. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant. But he also says it's a mystery. And actually, going back to Lance Lambert, he used to talk in the amazing about the mystery of Israel. And the mysteries of God are not things that God is hiding. They're the things he wants to reveal. The gospel is a mystery by his Spirit. But what I actually think, because you can talk to people, to Christians who don't have this understanding, and it's almost like your words just hit a wall. They just don't go in. And I feel like it's almost, and this is going to sound slightly sacrilege, but I don't mean it in that way. It's almost like dealing with people who don't know Jesus You can't force them to know Jesus. You can't, logic them into it. It has to be a work of the Holy Spirit. And with Christians who don't understand this, they are ignorant of the mystery. That's what Paul says. He says to all people, I want you to understand this. This should be part of the inheritance of every believer. It's been robbed. And most Christians are living with the after effects of centuries and centuries and centuries of a way of thinking. It's not easy for them to break out of this. I said in the book that God showed me this key of rewire, read without religion, which is actually quite hard. Is read as though you've never read the Bible before, and you'll suddenly go, so when it says Israel, it actually means Israel. Yeah. When God says he made an everlasting covenant with the Jewish people, he actually means everlasting, and so on. But our tradition tells us God's dealt with the Jews, now he's dealing with the church. So I think, for me... But probably because there is a little bit of a root of prejudice there. So it's very convenient to be completely dismissive and then start again. Yeah, absolutely. But I think most Christians feel like there's two trees. And Paul says, no, there isn't a Jewish tree that he got rid of and now a Christian tree. There's one tree. So I think, for me, one of the key things to not do with Christians is be that person who brings absolutely everything to Israel, and just force them. But instead, to provoke the Christians who don't understand this to jealousy with our sense of our understanding of our covenant, our understanding of the richness of the New Testament, who Jesus is. If we carry that, and we make Christians jealous rather than trying to force them. I'll tell you another one, that this was probably my earliest introduction to the subject, and that was this book on my dad's shelf entitled The Pillar of Fire. And there's no doubt, even though it's very graphic to do with the Shoah, the Holocaust, there's no doubt of this spiritual dimension of that. And so for Christians who believe in the spiritual realm, because I think many don't, so they've sort of naturalized everything, there's so much evidence of a demonic hatred. And so my next question is, and it is to a wider Christian audience as well, can what happened in the Holocaust and other terrible events like October the 7th, can that only be explained by the depravity of man, or let's say the fallenness of human nature, or must it be explained because of what the scripture calls the spiritual dimension? I'm saying that because we can argue about all the positives and whether we think it's this or that, but the negative is like an elephant in the room. Why is there all this hatred? Good question. I definitely feel like it's more than just the depravity of man and the fallenness. The fallenness of man leads to evil of all kinds, but this is so specific. It warrants us as believers understanding what's going on, and also the Bible explicitly tells us that this is going to be an issue. And I think of it like this. God says to mankind, fill the whole earth. Take, it's all yours, go multiply, take all the land. And then he's almost like goes, there's just this one bit of land. And he doesn't say it's their land, he says, it's my land. Just don't touch that. And what is the one bit of land that is most fought over in the whole world is that bit of land. Same way, he says, all the people of the earth, there's just this one people. And he doesn't call them, he just says they're my people. He who touches you touches the apple of my eye. And it's almost like God has invested in them as a nation of priests. Priests, well, they represent a bridge between God and man. And so God says, this one people, just don't touch them. What are the most hated, most persecuted people in the history of the world? The Jewish people. So I would say it has to be a spiritual thing. And right at the beginning, you see God saying to Abraham, the beginning of the creation of the Jewish people, the very creation, it's almost like God says, I know what's coming, so those who bless you, I will bless. Those who persecute you, I will persecute. Which is a very kind of interesting thing to say in a way when you're creating a people. You could say lots of things, but God basically says, there are going to be people who are going to love you and bless you, I'm going to bless them. And then there's going to be people who are going to persecute you and hate you. I'm going to deal with them. So I see it through that framework, and I don't think in any way that the fact that we are seeing what we're seeing now is even, and the history of anti-Semitism and how it morphs always into something new, but yet carries the same tropes and the same hatred, virulent hatred, that goes beyond the hatred of any other people. And it is an exceptional kind of hatred. That is to say, it makes an exception of the Jews in so many different ways.
Yeah, that's true.
It can't simply come from just the usual problems that we have.
Because we prior to, I mean, there's been terrible things through the history of Israel in the wars, and that's low level compared to what happened on October the 7th. And after the Holocaust, everyone, all decent people were saying never again, it was never happen again. And yet, within an absolute split second of October the 7th, everyone's forgotten the never again.
Yes.
That doesn't seem logical.
No. And the demonization of Israel, and it's what the Bible says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And here we are in a situation where these nations and these terrorist groups who explicitly say they want to wipe out Israel, they explicitly say they want to have a genocide, they explicitly talk about the depravity of Jewish people, use all sorts of crazy things, and explicitly aim. They're not shy about it. We want to destroy Israel, the little Satan. They're not accused of genocide. But Israel, which explicitly states it wants to live in peace with its neighbours, has the only real democracy in the Middle East, treats all religions fairly within Israel and so on, is the one that is accused of genocide and accused of wanting to do all sorts of things. So we've got a crazy situation.
Because they're demonized. So that's easy to believe. I mean, if they're vermin, if they're monkeys and pigs, then of course they're wanting to commit genocide.
Of course. And for me, that's why it starts with, for Christians, because sometimes what happens is you try and tell Christians, hey, you need to understand God's heart for Israel and so on. And therefore, but they have this picture of Jesus that's a Gentile, and then they're told, oh, you need to love Israel as well. And it doesn't fully work. But what God showed me when I was writing the first book was this series of 3 lenses, which is that if you really focus...
By the way, that's the Jewishness of Jesus.
The Jewish Jesus.
The Jewish Jesus.
Reconnect with the truth about Jesus, Israel, and the church.
Okay.
Because for me, those 3 things are linked, and I wanted to provide a platform for people, because it's quite... if we start with a correct picture of Jesus, for me that leads us then to a correct picture of who he is, a bit like Joseph underneath the Egyptian clothes. The Egyptians didn't realise, he still loves his family. Well, this is what's happening now, is that the veil is coming off, both for Jewish people. See, that the ignorance of the Gentiles and the blindness of the Jewish people, to me, is linked. And prophetically what's happening is the ignorance of the Gentiles is beginning to lift, and the blindness of the Jewish people is also beginning to lift. And these 2 things for me are entirely linked.
It's interesting because I sort of was a kid growing up at Halford House, so we did have an understanding with the Yom Kippur War that there's something on another level that's happening. But something, I've sort of observed, in my short life, is that there seems to be more of an openness among the wider Jewish community to evangelical Christians, in that they're not the threats that they were once perceived as, like the proselytizing, as you would say, cultural appropriators and all that. But that we have got something in common, and it is the Hebrew scriptures. The whole of the Bible is written by Jews. People could say Luke might not have been, but he might have been. And the unknown author of the Hebrews probably was. So, that's something that's never happened in church history, since Paul wrote the letter to the Roman church.
There's always been people, haven't there, who've carried that. But like you say, there's something happening now. And I think part of that is to do with this recalibrating of the way that we see the scriptures, and a bit more of an understanding of the continuity between what it's a funny thing, is we've got the Old and New Testament, but we call them the Old and New Testaments. So if you let go of that a bit and start to realize, hold on, how do these connect, you get a better picture. I think people are more aware of the issues about evangelizing in the wrong way, but also realizing there are threats that are coming against both communities.
Yeah.
And actually, for Jewish people, realizing one of the things that October the 7th last year showed Jewish people is more than ever that we are kind of, to some extent, on our own. It sounds harsh, but it's the truth. For all Jewish people, it was a very emotional time. For me, it's been an emotional year, and we've all got friends in Israel. We've all got family who are affected. You know, there's someone who lives in Brighton, if his cousin is still a hostage. I mean, but the silence of the world, apart from, like you said, that very beginning, but then the shifting of the narrative has made Jewish people, I think, realize we have to be together as a community, regardless of our differences. And that has helped a little bit, I think, the Messianic community, because people have seen in Israel and beyond that the Messianic community are there right in the mix. But it also has helped where there are Christians who are willing to just offer friendship and support without and here's a tract, you know.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Then there has been a growing, I think, a cohesion and a realization that we sort of need to be friends.
Yeah, so it's a really big subject. I was going to throw in one more, which was when the Lord said to the men on the road to Emmaus, how foolish you are not to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And the prophets have spoken quite a lot. But we see it happening. We're in the last minute, David, and we haven't even mentioned your song catalogue.
Yeah.
So, but people can find you online. Is it davidhoffbrand.com?
davidhoffbrand.com or Instagram. I'm just David Hoffbrand. It helps. I'm the only David Hoffbrand in the country, so I'm quite easy to find.
That's clever.
Hoffbrand, David Hoffbrand, Instagram or Facebook or wherever it is. I'm easy to follow and easy to find. I hope I've added to your catalogue now some of these questions, because there's some that folks don't get answers to in everyday life, so it's been very helpful. Oh, I'm glad, thank you. I've enjoyed it. Yeah, I have as well. I'm going to pick your brains a bit more later, but we're out of time. Thanks, David. Thank you. All the best. And thank you for joining us. See you next time on Face to Face.